Hello learners and viewers, welcome to this session. Today's topic is development facets and issues. I am Dr. G. Uma, faculty in the School of Gender and Development Studies. This topic is part of the course 2, that is MGS 002 as part of the program MA Gender and Development Studies. Let us discuss about this topic. Before that, I would like to talk about the block 1 of this course. This block 1 titled as Development Facets and Issues. Specifically under this block that today we discuss about the unit 1, that is the Integrated Sustainable Development Goals. How these goals, it's very important to address the various development issues, and after formulating the goals, whether these goals have addressed the gender issues or not, these are the few pertinent questions today we are going to discuss in this session. This block 1 has 5 units. The unit 1, as I have already mentioned, it is the Integrated Sustainable Development Goals. Unit 2 is about the education, development goals and upgradation of skills. Unit 3 is about the enhancing economic resources and SOG movement. Unit 4 also, it talks about the SOG movement, and the last one is at the regulatory framework. Regulatory framework is that in the era of market economy, there are various international laws that regulate the international trade between the countries. So in the unit 5, we specifically discuss about how these existing regulatory frameworks address the gender issues, whether these regulatory frameworks could able to integrate the women in the market economy or not. Let us start the unit 1, that is the Integrated Sustainable Development Goals. In the context of international development or global development, there is no defined concept about the development. Basically, when we talk about the international development or local development, we need to understand that it is a holistic concept and it is a multidisciplinary concept, and basically it addresses the human development, that is the development of greater quality of life for human beings. That is the important thing. Thus, when we talk about development, it encompasses governance, healthcare, education, gender equality, disaster preparedness, infrastructure, economy of the both global and national as well as local economy, human rights and environment and other issues associated with the human development. These are the broader areas the development encompasses at the international level. The international organizations like United Nations and other organizations like the World Bank and ILO, International Labour Organizations, and transnational organizations on like transnational level organization and regional level organizations like Asian Development Bank and other organizations, they try to address the issues at the international level. When they address the issues at the international level, the countries which are part of these organizations, they try to accept the resolutions passed at the international conventions and conferences. Once they accept the resolutions passed at the international convention and conferences, they could able to formulate necessary policies and programs at the national level to address these issues. For example, if you talk about the governance. Governance encompasses various factors, including at the local level, national level, and international level. When it comes to national and subnational level and local level, the governance, it's about not about the institutions. It's about how these institutions carry forward and address the various issues. That is the one thing about the governance. The second is about how these institutions are more inclusive in nature. That is the main reason the government of India could able to provide the reservation for women and other marginalized sections of the population. If you look at the reservation for women at the local level, already we have 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment Act, and most of the women, they could able to perform, they could able to address the women's issues and other gender and marginalized people's issues at the local level by looking at their contribution at the local level. Now the government has provided the reservation for women and other marginalized sections of the population at the national and subnational level. So it's like when it comes to healthcare, whether the women and other marginalized sections of the population, do they have access to health facilities or not? And with regard to education, due to the government policies and right to education, within each village, they have the at least primary schools within the 3-kilometer radius of their locality. Since women and marginalized sections of the population, they could able to access the schools, the women, they have more freedom and they could exercise their agencies to decide and to send their children, specifically girl children, to the schools. Like that, we at the international conventions and conferences, we could able to address the gender equality, disaster preparedness, various infrastructure issues, and economy at the various levels, human rights, environment, and other issues related to development. Thus, international development is different from a simple development. It's specifically composed of institutions, as I have already mentioned, and policies that arose after the Second World War. When we talk about these institutions, specifically international and multinational and transnational institutions, focus on alleviating poverty and improving living conditions in third world decolonized countries. Now we are not calling as third world decolonized countries, now we are calling as developing countries and underdeveloped countries. When we talk about the policies after the Second World War, here one must understand that after the Second World War, most of the developed nations, they got affected and their infrastructure is heavily damaged due to the Second World War. At the same time, countries like in India, many third world countries, specifically now what we call as developing nations, they got independence immediately after the Second World War. Second World War got over in 1945, and like country like in India, we got an independence in 1947. So once the third world countries, they got an independence, they need to address various issues, including improvement of the infrastructure, as well as they need to address the socio-economic issues, and they need to address the issues of the marginalized and other communities. And few, like in a third world countries, unlike developed nations, they face various development issues. Poverty is the major issues among when you analyze the poverty can have a differential impact on male, female, and other genders differently. And poverty can have an impact differently in the urban areas and rural areas. Due to the existing patriarchal nature, and the poverty among female are very high. This was proved through the existing data. Around 60% of the female in a specific group, they were in the state of poverty. Compared to male members, it has a differential impact. Like when we analyze the poverty, it has a gender differential impact that we need to understand that. So that decolonized countries, they not only need to address the issues of infrastructure and economy at the national and various levels, they need to address the socio-economic issues like poverty, gender issues, and the issues of marginalized and differences in the development at the rural and urban areas, and they are forced to improve their economy to generate more employment, to looking at the issues of third world countries. The United Nations not only address the issues of conflict between two countries, it started addressing the various development issues. So the international development, on the other hand, seeks to implement long-term solutions to problems by helping developing countries to create the necessary capacity needed to provide such as sustainable solutions to their problems. So in order to reduce their problems, specifically in the developing countries, the international organizations have organized many conventions, conferences for the well-being of the human beings. That we need to understand that. Second, these conventions and conferences may consist of single agenda or multi agendas. Basically, these conventions, they have a specific goals, and these goals are very transformative in nature to address the specific problem or series of goals targeted at several aspects in the society. These goals were promoted specifically to address the issues that specifically address the specific culture, politics, geography and economy of the region. So these goals can be we can consider these goals as an international in nature, but when you look at these goals are specific to particular region or particular countries. For an example, we could able to see that when you talk about education, if you look at the education or healthcare facilities, if you take India as an example for education and healthcare facilities, one could able to see that the availability of healthcare is more region specific or specific location specific. So it is therefore the country has to improve the healthcare facilities at the rural areas, then only. And when you talk about the healthcare facilities, even if the healthcare facilities also available, the access to healthcare facilities specifically gender in nature. Like male, they could able to access, but when it comes to female, they may, it is difficult for them to access healthcare due to the lack of infrastructure and like for example restrictions of their mobility and lack of enough resources to access healthcare facilities. That is the main reason that the government has to improve the healthcare facilities at the rural areas, and they need to improve the many primary health centers which can be very accessible to women and other marginalized sections of the population. Even children also, they could be able to access these facilities. That is the importance. So if you look at the international convention and conferences, these international conventions and conferences, the focus has been apart from focusing various development issues, the specific focus is on empowering women and children and building local economy and caring for the environment. Many countries from different parts of the world were the member of these conventions and conferences. For example, if you talk about specifically about the UN Action for Women, United Nations concern for the advancement of women began around 75 years ago. With the United Nations has founded in 1945. In its charter itself, the members of the UN declare their faith in fundamental human rights and in the equal rights of men and women. Since then, UN action for the advancement of women has taken 4 clear directions. One is the promotion of legal measures, mobilization of public opinion and international action, research and training, and direct assistance to disadvantaged groups. These are the 4 clear directions UN has taken. Because of it has specifically, it wants to concentrate the advancement of women. The United Nations decided to concentrate these 4 areas. Like for example, with regard to promotion of legal rights. Many UN conventions and conferences, it talked about the various treaties to help to define women's human rights, and whoever committed to honor these treaties and conventions, they have taken various legal measures at the national level, and they promoted equal rights for the women, and also the women, they could able to access legal services to protect their own human rights. Like that, there are various conventions for gender and development, conventions against discrimination in education, convention on consent to marriage, minimum age for marriage and registration of marriages in 1962, Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that is the SOGDS Convention, and Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women. These are the few conventions I am mentioning about that. Specifically, we need to discuss about the one convention, that is the SOGDS Convention. These SOGDS conventions, it is an international convention adopted in 18th December 1979 by the United Nations General Assembly in New York City. It is an international bill of rights for women. It came into force on 3rd September 1981. 186 countries are the members of this convention. The main goal of the convention is to reduce and to eradicate the discrimination against women and to promote gender equity. When you look at these conventions, that is the Declaration of Elimination of Violence Against Women in this international SOGDS convention, SOGDS wants to support the many countries to address the various issues. Specifically, the SOGDS has wants to the many countries, including India, they agreed to SOGDS convention, and India is also the party for the SOGDS convention. As per SOGDS convention, the discrimination against any women, I quote, any distinction, exclusion or restriction made on the basis of sex which has an effect or the purpose of impairing or nullifying the recognition, enjoyment or exercise by women irrespective of their marital status on the basis of equality of men and women, of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, civil or any other field. I unquote. This quote clearly establishes that agenda of action for putting an end to sex-based discrimination. This SOGDS convention was constituted with the experts of women's issues from different UN member states. This committee, they will meet once in a year to review the reports on compliance with the convention's provisions that the statutory in nature are required to submit every 4 years. When you look at the SOGDS conventions, even as I have already mentioned, India also party to the SOGDS conventions. The members of these SOGDS conventions, they meet once in a year, twice in a year, and they review the existing provisions in the SOGDS convention. Based on the review, they come to the conclusion whether the member states are compliance with the SOGDS, whatever they have signed in the SOGDS treaty, whether they could be able to implement the convention's resolution in their own countries. Apart from submission of report to the UN by the member states, other non-governmental organizations, other civil society organizations, they could also prepare, they were allowed to prepare the report regarding the implementation of the SIDA conventions in their respective countries. So these civil society organizations, they were allowed to submit their report in the United Nations. Thus the SIDA, based on the SIDA convention, most of these member countries, they could able to implement various provisions as per SIDA. Basically, SIDA convention clearly pointed out that based on the sex, no one should be discriminated. Even as per our Indian Constitution, Indian Constitution clearly points out that there is we should not discriminate on the basis of sex. That is the another important. So one is about the discrimination. Second one is that as per SIDA conventions, the member states, they need to formulate necessary policies and programs to implement the SIDA convention. That is the next important is that apart from these SIDA conventions, the UN, United Nations, it has organized 4 international world conferences. The first conferences happened in Mexico City in 1975. The second international women conferences held in Copenhagen. Third one is in Nairobi in 1985 and fourth is the 1995. If you look at these 4 conferences, in the beginning, United Nations could able to convene the conferences once in 5 years. After Nairobi conference, it took a decade to convene the international conference for women in Beijing in 1995. The first conference, world conference in 1995 held by looking at the existing status of women and existing status of women in the areas of education, health, and access to various resources, and their representation in macroeconomy by looking at the women's labor force participation. Then the UN came to the conclusion that it is important to organize the international conferences to address the issues of the women. By looking at the women's status and position, the first conference was held in Mexico City. In that first conference, the feminists, they have proposed the women in development theoretical understanding. As per women in development theory, the existing studies clearly point out that the women are not properly integrated in the public spaces. It is pertinent to take necessary efforts to integrate women into the public spaces. Specifically, they have to be integrated in the economy, education, and other various sectors. Once they get integrated, once they could able to earn like a male members, once they could able to control and access and control over resources, the feminists thought that their status and position automatically improve. That's why they have proposed the women in development approach. As per the women in development approach, many countries, including India, they could able to formulate necessary policies and programs to improve the women's status and position. Next conference was held in Copenhagen in 1980. In these Copenhagen conferences, not only women in development, the feminists, they have proposed the after studying the implementation of women in development, they came to the conclusion that it is not that women has not integrated in the macroeconomy. They have integrated, but they have integrated in a very unequal manner due to the existing patriarchy and socialization process. So it is important to address the existing gender and social relations. Once we could able to address the gender and social relations, then we could able to address these existing unequal relations. The third conference held in Nairobi, that is the very significant conference. We call it as the birth of global feminism in 1985. In this conference, there is a two kinds of discussion was held. Then specifically in the third International Women's Conference in Nairobi, the feminists from third world countries, they have formed a separate group, and they have formed the group called DAWN to address the various issues faced by the women in the third world countries, because the women from the feminists from the developed nations, they were talked about only rights of the women, but the feminists from the third world countries, they realized that along with the rights, the women in the third world countries, they are facing like various issues, various structural issues that needs to be addressed. Finally, the last conference was held in Beijing. In that Beijing conference, very significant proposal was submitted, that is the birth of the gender and development approach. As per after analyzing the various approaches and its implementation and analyzing the women's status and position, in the Beijing conference, the feminists, they have proposed the alternative approach, that is called gender and development approach. In that gender and development approach, the feminists, they have proposed that it is not about that the women have integrated unequally, but it is significant to address the existing gender relations. Once we could able to address the existing gender relations through various tools and other policies and programs, we could able to alter the gender relations. It is important to alter the existing gender relations to bring the equity and equality in the society. These are the 4 international conferences. Through these conferences, the international organization could able to bring the various perspectives to integrate the women into the existing development process and to address the various issues faced by the women. Other development convention and conferences include International Conference on Population and Development, Millennium Development Goals in 2000, and Sustainable Development Goals in 2020. So if you look at these development goals, these international conventions and conferences specifically organize to address the various issues, including gender issues. Whoever party to these international conferences, they need to take an appropriate policies and programs at the national level to address these issues. Thank you so much for listening to this session. We will meet again to address to discuss next block. Thank you.